What if the person you hurt the most became the one to save your life? This is the story of a desperate woman, rejected by everyone, who walks into a job interview only to face the man she had humiliated years ago. She expected revenge, but what happened next will leave you speechless. Stay with us as we uncover a powerful comments below where you're watching from, and if you like and love our story, kindly subscribe our channel. Life, inspirational, and motivational tales that explore themes of love, unity, and patriotism. Stay with us always for interesting stories. Thanks. Let's start the story. The dim light from a flickering bulb barely illuminated the cramped apartment. Piles of unpaid bills sat on a worn wooden table, each one a reminder of how far her life had spiraled. She sat hunched over in a creaky chair, her hands trembling as she clutched a dog-eared job application. Her eyes darted to the corner where her young daughter slept soundly on a makeshift bed, unaware of the harsh reality surrounding them. The woman's once proud face now bore the marks of endless sleepless nights and relentless worry. She whispered to herself, "This has to work. It's my last chance." The words felt hollow, but desperation fueled her resolve. She had been turned down so many times that she had stopped counting, but this time felt different, or at least she hoped it would. She felt her shoulders fall to their depths and lowered herself. The walls seemed to close in as the weight of her situation bore down on her. She took a deep breath, her mind flashing back to better days when she had a stable job, a sense of pride and security. That was before she had moved to this city, before everything fell apart. What she didn't know was that the application in her hands would lead her to an unexpected encounter, one that would change the course of her life forever. "Put your hands behind your back," she commanded as she moved to the foot of her bed. Her companion rose too and entered the room with her. The person she was about to meet wasn't just a stranger, but someone she had hurt deeply in the past. Years ago, she had been a manager at a bustling corporate office, seated at the top of her game. Confident and sharp-tongued, she ruled her department with an iron fist. Her words carried weight, and her opinions were rarely questioned. Among the staff was a young black man who had just joined her team. He was bright, eager, and full of potential. Yet to her, he was simply another face to control. On a fateful day, during a team meeting, he presented a report he had worked on tirelessly. His ideas were innovative, and his delivery was poised, but she cut him off midway with a dismissive laugh. "I'm not sure where you learned to do things," she said, her tone dripping with condescension, "but this isn't how we operate here." Her words stung, but it was the laughter that followed, encouraged by her sharp remarks, that left a deeper wound. Her critiques were harsh and public, turning what could have been constructive feedback into an exhibition of her authority. Over the weeks, she found more ways to belittle him, questioning his capabilities in front of peers, and piling him with menial tasks that undermined his role. On more than one occasion, subtle remarks laced with prejudice slipped out, leaving him humiliated and isolated. Through it all, the young man carried himself with quiet dignity. He never raised his voice, never retaliated, but his eyes spoke of the fire within him. He remained calm, even as the environment grew unbearable. The final straw came when she berated him in front of a senior executive, claiming his work was subpar and unfit for the company's standards. That day, He handed in his resignation without a word. As he walked out of the office, a spark of determination ignited within him. He vowed to prove her wrong. Not out of spite, but as a testament to his own worth. While she continued her career with no thought of the damage she'd done, he began his journey to build something far greater than anyone could have imagined. The present was a stark contrast to her past. Once commanding boardrooms and teams, she now spent her days navigating the bleak reality of unemployment. After her last company downsized, she found herself discarded, her once sterling reputation overshadowed by whispers of her harsh management style and inability to adapt to modern work practices. Each rejection chipped away at her confidence, leaving her doubting not only her skills, but her worth. Every morning she sat at the same wobbly kitchen table, combing through job postings, her coffee growing cold beside her. Her inbox was a graveyard of rejection emails, each one colder than the last. Interviews came rarely, and when they did, her shaky answers and outdated knowledge only solidified the interviewer's decisions to pass her over. The guilt of her past weighed heavily on her during the quiet nights. Though she rarely admitted it aloud, memories of the people she had treated poorly, those she dismissed, undermined, or belittled, haunted her. A part of her wondered if karma had finally caught up. She often thought of the young black man she had humiliated years ago. Though she never apologized, she wished she had. The memory of his calm, pained expression lingered like a shadow in her mind. Her desperation reached its peak when she stumbled across a listing for a high-level administrative position at a prestigious company. The name of the company alone was enough to make her hesitate, but desperation overruled her doubts. She sent in her resume, knowing this could be her last shot at stability. When the email arrived inviting her to interview, relief coursed through her. She prepared meticulously, rehearsing answers in front of her mirror and poring over articles about the company's rise to success. She read about its visionary CEO, who had transformed the business into a powerhouse in just a few years. Little did she know, the man behind the articles was someone she had crossed paths with before, a man whose face she had once seen break under the weight of her words. The morning of the interview arrived, and she found herself staring at her reflection in the mirror. Adjusting her blazer yet again, the fabric felt tighter than it used to, a reminder of how much her life had changed in the last few years. She forced herself to smile, trying to muster confidence she didn't truly feel. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up her bag, clutching the resume she had spent hours revising. This interview was not just an opportunity, it was her lifeline. Failure was not an option, though it loomed as a constant shadow in her thoughts. As the cab pulled up to the towering headquarters, her nerves tightened into a knot. The sleek glass exterior of the building seemed to mock her, its pristine facade a sharp contrast to the chaos of her own life. She hesitated for a moment, breathing deeply, before stepping out and walking through the grand revolving doors. The air inside was cool and sterile, the hum of productivity echoing around her. A receptionist with a bright smile handed her a visitor badge and directed her to the waiting area. She found a seat, her heart pounding in her chest as she scanned the surroundings. The lobby was a testament to modern success: soaring ceilings, gleaming floors, and minimalist decor that spoke of efficiency and power. She clutched her resume tighter, feeling like an outsider in a world she used to command. Her wandering eyes landed on the portraits lining the walls. Each one showcased a key executive, their names and titles etched in elegant plaques beneath their photos. As she moved from face to face, one particular portrait stopped her cold. Her breath caught in her throat, and her palms grew clammy. It was him? The man in the photo stared back at her with quiet confidence. His features were unmistakable, though years of growth and success had sharpened them. His name was prominently displayed beneath the image, followed by the title, Chief Executive Officer. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The young black man she had humiliated all those years ago now owned this company. He wasn't just an employee. He was the boss. Her mind raced with memories she had tried to suppress. She could see him standing before her in that meeting, his shoulders squared but his eyes filled with pain as she tore him down in front of their colleagues. She remembered the sharpness of her own words, the way she had laughed dismissively at his ideas. And now, here he was, in a position of power she could never have imagined. The sound of her name being called jolted her out of her thoughts. A staff member approached, gesturing for her to follow. Her legs felt like lead as she stood and walked toward the elevator. The ride up was silent, but her mind screamed with questions. Would he recognize her? Would he even care to acknowledge her? Or worse, would he remember every cruel word she had spoken? The staff member led her into a sleek conference room, its glass walls offering a breathtaking view of the city skyline. The room was pristine, every detail meticulously arranged. She sat down at the long table, gripping the edge of her chair to steady herself. Moments later, the head of human resources entered, introducing himself warmly. He began the interview with standard questions, his tone polite but professional. She answered as best she could, though her thoughts were clouded by the knowledge of who was in charge of this company. Every time she tried to focus, the image of that portrait came back to her. The realization of what she had done, of who she was now sitting in the building of, was almost too much to bear. At her request, she was asked to receive a medical examination. Midway through the interview, the door opened. Her heart stopped. He walked in, his presence commanding without a word. He was taller now, broader in the shoulders, his tailored suit a testament to his success. His face was calm, his movements deliberate. He nodded politely to the HR manager before taking a seat at the head of the table. She froze, her breath catching in her throat as their eyes met. It was him, there was no mistaking it. Her heart raced as she tried to read his expression, but his face betrayed nothing. He seemed calm, almost indifferent, as though he had no recollection of her at all. For a moment, she wondered if this was a mercy or a cruelty. Somehow, however, she knew that this was a cruelty. The HR manager continued with his questions, but her answers came slower now. Her composure was unraveling under the weight of his silent presence. She felt as though every word she spoke was being measured, not just for her suitability for the role, but for her worth as a person. Finally, the HR manager wrapped up his portion of the interview, excusing himself to fetch some documents. The room grew unbearably quiet as the CEO remained seated, his gaze fixed on her. She avoided his eyes, staring down at her hands, which were now clammy and trembling. "You seem familiar," he said after a moment, his voice even and calm. She nodded. Her throat tightened. She forced herself to meet his gaze, though her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear her own thoughts. I think we worked together before," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded slowly, leaning back in his chair. "Yes, we did. It's been a long time." The weight of his words settled over her like a heavy fog. He remembered. There was no escaping it now. The guilt she had carried for years threatened to crush her entirely. He turned to face her. "What have you told the woman?" She began, but her voice faltered. She swallowed hard, trying again. "I want to say that I'm sorry for how I treated you. It was wrong, and I've regretted it ever since." Her admission hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. She expected anger, a cold dismissal, or even a sharp rebuke. Instead, he studied her for a moment before nodding. "Thank you," he said simply. His tone was not bitter or resentful, but measured and thoughtful. "But let's focus on the present. This isn't about the past. It's about whether you're the right fit for the role." His kindness caught her off guard. She had braced herself for retribution, for him to use this moment to exact revenge. Instead, he was extending her a grace she knew she didn't deserve. Her emotions threatened to overwhelm her, but she forced herself to stay composed. The conversation shifted back to professional matters, but her mind remained clouded with thoughts of the past. Every question he asked seemed laden with unspoken meaning, yet his demeanor remained calm and professional. When the interview finally ended, he stood and extended his hand once more. "Thank you for coming in," he said warmly. "We'll be in touch." She shook his hand, her grip weak, and murmured her thanks. As she left the conference room and walked back through the pristine halls, her emotions churned within her. She had come here hoping for a job, but what she had found was something far more profound. The man she had wronged so deeply had treated her with dignity and respect, and the weight of his forgiveness was both humbling and unbearable. As she exited the building and stepped onto the bustling street, she couldn't stop the tears from streaming down her face. The memory of his calm, forgiving demeanor stayed with her, a stark contrast to the person she had been. For the first time in years, she felt the stirrings of hope, not just for her career, but for her ability to change. He had been watching her from the adjoining room, the glass window tinted to allow him to observe unnoticed. She sat in the conference room, answering the HR manager's questions with a nervous energy that betrayed her attempts at confidence. He studied her carefully, noting the subtle changes since the last time they had crossed paths years ago. The woman sitting before him now seemed a shadow of the person he had known back then, a person who had wielded power carelessly, unaware of the pain she inflicted. For a moment he debated whether to intervene. Memories of their past interactions bubbled to the surface, each one a painful reminder of how far he had come since then. Yet, as he watched her fumble through her responses, he sensed something different, an undercurrent of vulnerability and desperation that hadn't been there before. He sighed, stepping away from the window. His mind was made up. It wasn't about the past. It was about what kind of leader he wanted to be now. He walked toward the conference room, his footsteps measured, his resolve firm. "The car should be waiting," said Rourke, swung aside to allow Henry and Tim to pass. The door opened quietly and her head snapped up, her face a mixture of apprehension and recognition. The HR manager paused mid-question, standing respectfully as he entered. "Please continue," he said with a polite nod before taking a seat at the head of the table. His presence shifted the energy in the room, and she seemed to shrink slightly under his gaze. She tried to refocus, but his presence was impossible to ignore. Her answers became shorter, more hesitant, as though she feared saying the wrong thing. He let the HR manager finish his portion of the interview before raising a hand to indicate he wanted to speak. End of chapter. "Thank you for your responses so far," he began, his voice calm and measured. "I have a few questions of my own." "Percy?" She nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He leaned forward slightly, his tone conversational but deliberate. "You've had an extensive career in management, but I'm curious, what have been some of the most significant challenges you've faced in working with the team?" Her breath hitched for a moment. The question seemed innocent enough, but she felt the weight behind it. She hesitated before answering, carefully choosing her words. "In my earlier years," she began slowly, I struggled with understanding how to truly lead. I thought being in charge meant having all the answers, but I've come to realize it's more about listening and empowering others." Her voice softened. "I've made mistakes, big ones, but they've taught me the importance of humility and collaboration." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Humility is an important lesson," he said. "Would you say you've applied that lesson in your more recent roles?" Her cheeks flushed slightly and she looked down. "I've tried to," she said quietly. "It's not easy to change, but I've learned to acknowledge my flaws and work on them." He observed her for a long moment, the silence stretching just enough to make her shift in her seat. Then he leaned back, his tone softening. You may not realize it, but we've met before." Her face went pale. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. He saw the flash of recognition in her eyes, followed by shame. "I remember the last time we worked together," he continued, his voice steady but laced with meaning. "It was a different time, and we were different people. I won't pretend that experience didn't leave an impression." As we returned to the office that evening, starlight filtered the window. Tears welled in her eyes as she struggled to respond. I know I hurt you," she said, her voice breaking. "I was wrong, and I don't have any excuse for the way I treated you. I've carried that guilt with me for years." He held her gaze, letting her words hang in the air before speaking. "It's not about excuses," he said gently. "It's about growth. The person you were then doesn't have to define who you are now." Her tears spilled over, but she quickly wiped them away, nodding. His words carried no anger, no bitterness, only a sense of purpose. It was a grace she hadn't expected and didn't feel she deserved. He shifted the conversation back to her professional experience, asking thoughtful and probing questions about her skills and aspirations. Slowly, she began to relax, her responses becoming more confident. He could see glimpses of the capable professional she once was, buried under layers of self-doubt and regret. After nearly an hour of discussion, he closed his notebook and smiled faintly. "Thank you for answering my questions so honestly," he said. "It's clear you've faced challenges, but it's also clear that you've grown because of them." Her chest tightened, and she braced herself for his final judgment. When he spoke again, his words stunned her, and her eyes widened. He continued, "I'm offering you the position," he said simply. Her eyes widened in disbelief. You are?" "Yes," he replied. "You have the qualifications, the experience, and most importantly, the potential to contribute meaningfully here. Everyone deserves a second chance to prove what they're capable of. She couldn't hold back her emotions any longer. Tears streamed down her face as she clasped her hands together, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "After everything I did, I never thought." "You don't need to thank me," he said, his tone kind but firm. "This isn't about me. It's about what you do with this opportunity. Use it well." She stood, her legs shaky, and extended her hand. "I will," she said earnestly. "I promise." He shook her hand, his grip steady and reassuring. "Welcome to the team." As she left the room, a mixture of relief and gratitude washed over her. For the first time in years, she felt hope. Hope not only for her career, but for the possibility of becoming a better person. His kindness had transformed more than her circumstances. It had transformed her understanding of grace and redemption. Inside the conference room, he sat for a moment, reflecting. Offering her the job wasn't an act of forgetting the past, but an act of choosing to believe in the future. He had given her a chance, and in doing so, reaffirmed his belief in the power of forgiveness. She couldn't believe the words she had just heard. He had offered her the job, an opportunity she had convinced herself she would never deserve, let alone receive. As the realization settled in, the weight of her guilt grew unbearable. Every word he had spoken, every act of grace he had shown, only deepened the ache in her chest. She sat frozen for a moment, staring at the door of the conference room, unsure whether to leave or to stay, and finally confront the storm of emotions that had been building inside her. "You'll pick up on that," Petroposa said. Before she could stop herself, she turned back, her footsteps hesitant as she re-entered the room. He was still seated, reviewing papers on the table, but looked up when she stepped in. The kindness in his expression made her throat tighten. "Is something wrong?" he asked, his tone calm, as if he hadn't just changed the trajectory of her life with a single decision. She opened her mouth to speak, but faltered, her words catching in her throat. The courage she had summoned to walk back into the room now felt distant, replaced by an overwhelming sense of shame. Her hands trembled as she clutched her bag, her emotions threatening to spill over. "I can't leave without saying something," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, setting his papers aside and giving her his full attention. "Go ahead." Tears welled in her eyes as she took a shaky breath. "I don't understand how you can be so kind to me after everything I've done. You could have humiliated me, you could have turned me away, and you would have been right to. But instead, you chose to help me. Why?" And then the kiss made her feel her whole world moving. Her voice cracked with the weight of her words, and the tears she had been holding back finally escaped. She wiped at her face, embarrassed by her lack of composure, but she couldn't stop now. "I treated you so horribly. I hurt you in ways I can't even begin to apologize for. I was arrogant and cruel, and I've regretted it every day since." She looked down, her hands twisting the strap of her bag as if searching for something to hold on to. "I don't deserve this job," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I don't deserve your kindness." I gave her a faint smile. He listened quietly, his expression thoughtful. When she finally raised her tear-streaked face to meet his gaze, there was no trace of anger or resentment in his eyes. Instead, there was a calm understanding, a sense of clarity that only deepened her sense of awe. "You're right," he said gently. "You did hurt me. At the time, it felt unfair and painful, and I carried those memories with me for a long time. but I also learned something important from that experience. She blinked, caught off guard. What could you have possibly learned from someone like me? He leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table as he spoke. I learned that the way people treat you says more about them than it does about you. Your actions back then weren't about who I was. They were about who you were at that time. And while they hurt, they also pushed me to prove myself, to rise above the labels and judgments people placed on me. In a way, your cruelty fueled my determination. Her breath hitched as his words sank in. The idea that her worst behavior had somehow contributed to his success was both humbling and devastating. But, he continued, his tone softening, holding on to anger or resentment would have only hurt me in the long run. I've learned that forgiveness isn't about excusing someone's actions. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of their mistakes. Carrying that anger would have held me back from becoming the person I wanted to be. She stared at him, her tears flowing freely now. His words were so measured, so full of grace, that she felt unworthy of even being in his presence. "How can you forgive me after everything?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't deserve it." He smiled faintly, a warmth in his expression that seemed to ease the tension in the room. "Maybe you don't," he said honestly. "But forgiveness isn't about deserving, it's about choosing to let go. And I choose to believe that people can change, that they can grow. The fact that you're standing here, acknowledging your mistakes, tells me you're not the same person you were back then." Her knees felt weak and she sank into a chair across from him, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his forgiveness. "I don't know how to thank you," she said through her tears. "You've done more for me in this moment than I could ever repay." "You don't need to repay me," he said simply. "What I want is for you to succeed, not just in this job, but in becoming the person you're capable of being. That's the real challenge, taking what you've learned and using it to build something better." MLAS is still used in the UK to treat people with brain diseases, ranging from sudden to complex. She nodded, her heart heavy with gratitude and regret. "I will," she promised. "I'll work harder than I ever have. I'll earn this opportunity." "I believe you will," he said, his voice steady. "This job isn't just a second chance. It's a chance for you to prove to yourself that you're more than your past." The weight of his words settled over her, a mixture of relief and responsibility. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of hope, not just for her career, but for her ability to change. She stood, wiping her face and extending her hand. "Thank you," she said sincerely, "for forgiving me a chance, for everything." End of letter. He stood as well, taking her hand in his. "Good luck," he said with a small smile. "Make the most of it." As she left the room, her emotions still raw, she realized that this moment was about more than a job. It was about redemption, about the power of grace to transform even the deepest wounds. She walked out of the building with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to live up to the faith he had shown in her. Inside the conference room, he watched her go, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over him. Forgiving her hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary, not just for her growth, but for his own. He had chosen to believe in the possibility of change, and in doing so, had written a new chapter for both of them. The first day at her new job dawned with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. As she stepped into the gleaming office building, the same space that had once filled her with dread now felt like a beacon of opportunity. Her footsteps echoed softly in the hallway as she approached her new workstation, taking in the polished floors and bustling energy of her colleagues. She was determined to start fresh, to earn the place she had been so graciously given. Her first week was challenging but invigorating. She spent long hours familiarizing herself with the company's systems, studying every document she could find, and asking questions whenever she needed clarification. Her colleagues, initially hesitant, soon recognized her genuine efforts. They began offering assistance, sharing advice, and including her in their discussions. Though she still felt the weight of her past, she used it as fuel to push herself harder. The black man who had once been her victim, now her boss, maintained his professional demeanor, never drawing attention to their shared history. He observed her quietly, his eyes noting the subtle changes in her behavior. She approached tasks with humility, sought feedback eagerly, and always prioritized the success of the team over her own recognition. One afternoon, as she worked late on a project, he stopped by her desk. "How's it coming along?" he asked, his tone calm and encouraging. She looked up, surprised but grateful for his attention. "It's coming together," she replied. "I'm just finalizing a few details. I want to make sure it's perfect." She turned back around and stared at the ceiling. "What's the matter?" she asked, turning to him. Her expression seemed drowsy and shaken. He nodded, glancing over her work. "You're doing well," he said. "Remember, it's about progress, not perfection." His words stayed with her long after he left, a reminder that growth wasn't about erasing mistakes but learning from them. Weeks turned into months, and she began to find her rhythm. Her colleagues started seeking her input, respecting her insights and valuing her contributions. She no longer hesitated to voice her ideas, but this time, her confidence was tempered by empathy and a willingness to listen. The woman who had once been feared for her sharp tongue now earned admiration for her measured and thoughtful approach. Her relationship with the black man evolved as well. Though their interactions remained professional, there was an unspoken understanding between them, a recognition of the journey they had both taken to reach this point. During team meetings, he often challenged her with difficult questions, not to undermine her, but to push her to think deeper. She met those challenges with determination, her answers growing more nuanced and insightful with each passing day. One day, he invited her to his office for a one-on-one meeting. As she sat across from him, she couldn't help but feel a pang of nervousness. "You've been here for 6 months now," he began, leaning back in his chair. "How do you feel about your progress?" She took a moment to gather her thoughts. "I feel like I'm finally finding my place," she admitted. "I've learned so much, not just about the job, but about myself. I'm trying to be better, more thoughtful, more open. I hope it's showing." He nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "It is. Your work speaks for itself. But it's your attitude that has made the biggest impression. People notice when someone is genuine, and you've proven that you're committed to growth." His praise filled her with a quiet pride, but it was his next words that truly struck her. "I want you to know that your journey doesn't go unnoticed," he said. "Not just by me, but by the people you work with. You've shown that change is possible, and that's something powerful. Don't stop now." He then asked the crew to all raise their glasses. They did so and proceeded to raise their glasses. She left his office that day with a renewed sense of purpose. His belief in her wasn't just a gift, It was a responsibility, one she intended to honor. End of. Over time, she began taking on more responsibilities, often volunteering for projects that allowed her to mentor newer employees. She made it a point to advocate for those who felt overlooked, ensuring that everyone's voice was heard. Her own experiences of failure and redemption gave her a unique perspective, one that resonated with those around her. Jamie Dean, welcome. One particularly poignant moment came when a junior employee confided in her about facing subtle discrimination from a client. She listened intently, her heart aching as she remembered her own behavior in the past. "I understand how that feels," she said softly. "But you don't have to face it alone. Let's address this together." She worked with the employee to document the incidents and presented the case to the black man during a leadership meeting. He listened carefully, nodding as she outlined the issue and proposed solutions. By the end of the discussion, he commended her for her advocacy and took immediate steps to address the problem. The experience reinforced her belief that true leadership was about lifting others up, not tearing them down. As the months turned into a year, she reflected on how far she had come. The job that had once been a lifeline had become a source of fulfillment and pride. She no longer worked out of desperation, but out of a genuine desire to contribute, to build, and to grow. Her transformation was evident not only in her work, but in her relationships. She had built a strong rapport with her colleagues, earning their trust and respect, and her connection with the black man had deepened into one of mutual admiration. One day, during a company event, she found herself standing beside him as they watched the team celebrate a successful quarter. "You've created something amazing here," she said. Gesturing to the lively scene before them, he looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "It's not just me," he replied. "It's everyone who chooses to show up, to work hard, to believe in something bigger than themselves. That includes you." Her heart swelled at his words. For so long she had defined herself by her mistakes, but now she realized that her journey was about more than redemption. It was about becoming the person she was meant to be. God. Yes. As she walked home that evening, the city lights shimmering around her, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. The man she had once hurt had not only given her a second chance, but had shown her the power of forgiveness and the importance of believing in others. She vowed to carry those lessons forward, dedicating herself to helping others and ensuring that her actions always reflected the values she had come to cherish. Her story was no longer one of failure and regret. It was a story of transformation, hope, and the enduring power of kindness to change lives. Not just her own, but the lives of everyone she touched. And sometimes, the people we hurt the most are the ones who can teach us the greatest lessons in kindness and forgiveness. This story isn't just about redemption. It's about the power of grace to transform lives, about how one act of compassion can ripple outward, changing not only individuals, but the world around them. Now it's your turn to reflect. Think about the moments in your life when someone showed you forgiveness, even when you didn't deserve it. Or perhaps there was a time you offered grace to someone who had wronged you, and it changed their path. We all carry biases, mistakes, and regrets, but we also carry the ability to learn, to grow, and to make amends. What matters most is what we choose to do with the lessons we've been given. Have you ever been given a second chance that changed your life? Or have you ever extended a second chance to someone else? Share your story in the comments below. Let's start a conversation about the power of forgiveness and how it can make the world a kinder, more understanding place. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that touch the heart and remind us of the strength of humanity. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. And share this video with someone who needs a little hope today. Together, let's spread the message of kindness, forgiveness, and transformation.